ahead.
Good morning, Mel. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
I'm excited. We're going to talk about AI today, I think.
Yes, that's the idea.
I feel like I'm hanging out with the cool kids today. That's all the cool kids are talking about AI.
Oh, yeah. I've been amazed at how quickly the subject of AI has become kind of ubiquitous and normalized everywhere so quickly.
It's like wildfire.
It's like wildfire. It's crazy. And actually, when we were chatting about what to talk about today and AI, part of me was like, well, I'm not like an expert at AI, and if people can listen to podcasts about that have experts in AI speaking, but I suppose maybe what we can talk about is more maybe the big picture from a philosophical perspective, and maybe I can take a few guesses comparing AI to like more traditional life forms and brains and things like that, so we can see what connections we can make.
Yeah, and there's also this interesting thing about that we study traditional knowledge, in traditional writing, and what is the use of AI in traditional scholarship, and then also there's this very interesting topic that doesn't get talked about that much. Um, well, maybe it does, but the idea of what is consciousness, what is thinking, what is knowledge, and for a modern person, there's a definite slant on that. Although, honestly, if you ask most people what those three things are,
Yep.
they don't really know. Even people who study the field and you ask them what consciousness is, it's kind of hard to get an answer.
Yes.
Kind of that thing like, what is love? Everybody knows it, but you can't really define it in a certain way. But there is a way to think about it in a modern way. And then the ancient people had their own way of thinking about it. And they had a very technical way of thinking about it too. And how does that earlier way of thinking about these ideas inform how we live today? And especially now that we're interacting with something like AI, how does it do that? So there are tons of questions here. Let's get started. What
Let's get
should we start?
started. Come on, no time like the present. Let's explore this stuff.
Yeah, what would be a good jumping off point? You got any ideas?
Well, why don't we start with things that you were alluding to about consciousness?
Sure. So, I have this thing from my experience as an aging translator working in a different time and place that a perspective of modern people that although we think we're advanced, we're actually just born in terms of our operating, what I call our human operating system, which means well, how do we use our brains, our thinking, our understanding of our place in the universe, and that we're just getting used to, and especially this thing we call story, story and images, and that we're not very good at, we don't have a good understanding of what those things are. We've talked before about how, when we see something with our eyes, it's actually not the thing that we're seeing. It's an image that's created by our brain with neural networks and so forth. And that creates stories that are filters through which we see the world. Um, so there's a lot of meaty information here. If we just think about the ideas of thinking and consciousness, we might focus on a couple of terms. One is what is knowledge, what is thinking, um, and what is consciousness. Those are three big ones. And the Neijing, for example, the early Chinese texts have a very technical understanding of what that is, related to patterns of nature and breath, and that they're all expressions of that. But for modern people, we might say perhaps knowledge is organizations of information. For example, and this goes to the way that neural networks work, which is both the way our brain works and how AI works in a way, although there's some differences, which is your brain doesn't do Google searches on everything every time you query it, but it has these big areas of understanding, like, for example, animals is an understanding field, and then dogs is an understanding field, and then pets is an understanding field. And those are organizations of information. So if someone asks you, how is your pet doing today? It goes to these fields, and that's how it does it so quickly. And those fields get strengthened by use and so forth in both AI and the brain. And so that's how the AI can work so quickly. It doesn't have to search through everything, but it's using these field of neural networks to quickly access something. So we might say like knowledge is the collection of information or an organization of information. And then thinking might be the interactions that we have with those fields of knowledge. So, for example, someone asks you about your pet, cat, my cat Rosie, and I go into that field and I interact with it. And we might call that thinking. You know, I'm just trying to think of some basic ideas for modern people. Consciousness is a little different. We might say that's the embodiment of the process of thinking and knowledge in a certain way, or of being. Or it's also used in the terms of self referential awareness, like I am conscious because I am aware of myself. Like in aging nature based medicine, we talk about the universe as a conscious field. And what that means is that there's information out there and it's not random and it's interacting all together at the same time. We call that immersive consciousness in a certain way. Like, how does a cloud turn and the river changes in response? But then when modern people are talking about consciousness, they're often saying, I am a conscious being. And then we ask, is the universe conscious? And we're trying to say, is it conscious like me? But if we talk about it as kind of the embodiment of the process of knowing in a certain way, then we could say nature also has these qualities too. How's that for a start? What do you
There
think?
you go. Well, I hope hope everyone's like appropriately caffeinated or whatever your upper stimulant of choice is. I mean, yeah, these are great. Um, it's funny as I was chewing on this topic and wanting to come at it from a perspective of some ideas about how AI might be similar or different to like animals' brains or human brains and that sort of thing. Something a little bit disconcerting happened, which is as I tried to make the distinction, I started to think that actually AI might be alive. Because I kept like invalidating my own, like, well, because one thing you said was like the embodiment of consciousness. And so my first thought was like, so AI can do like lots of thinking and really really fast, and it can access this knowledge ways that you've just defined it. But a big thing about animals and humans is that we get all of this information coming from our context, through our bodies and through, let's say, social constructs and all that information, language and all of that, that's really selecting. But then I realized, well, if you take this computer right here, what I'm holding up an iPhone, and it has a gyroscope on it, which means that as I change the angle of it, different numbers comes up. Well, that's actually the vestibular system. It knows which way is up and it knows which angle it's being held at. So that is actually one aspect of embodiment. And then if you put AI into a robot, again, it's going to be getting some of that. Not to, I know, not to the same extent, but I thought, well, actually, no, it does have embodied consciousness. If it's sensing temperature and then changing its output based on that, that's embodied consciousness. Um,
Right.
and
And,
yeah,
and you might even say, like, if we talk about, as a river conscious, and you might say, well, it's, like a river flowing down a mountain, the side of a mountain, it's actually making decisions about where to go all the time in relationship to its environment based on certain patterns. And we might call that kind of an embedded, a certain kind of consciousness too. It's not just random. All these things are happening. But there are, I think there's a couple of really important differences. And one relates to the heart. I'll just put that as a pin in it for later because AI does not have a heart as I understand it. And it's also how it arrives at the result. So, for example, if I'm going out with a friend and someone asks me, how's Rosie, your cat? You know, and I'm going to formulate an answer. And I'm going to formulate the answer in part on how the cat is doing, but I'm also going to formulate it on how my answer will affect my friendship with the other person, how I can facilitate a relationship, how I can facilitate a conversation. And all those things are getting edited into my answer, right? In AI, it's really important to understand like how it arrives at an answer.
Yeah.
And, so it has all this information. It has what we call the knowledge, from searching, from ingesting the internet, basically. And then it's making decisions on probabilistic statistics. So it's looking at a certain string of ideas: cat, how are you? How's your cat doing? Blah, blah, blah. And then making a determination what is statistically most likely to be the next word in the phrase. So that it has no agenda in a certain way as we understand it, except to have a predictive value of what's the best fitting word next in the sentence.
Yeah. It,
And that's very different.
it's interesting because like that's very different, and to me like the somewhat disconcerting thing is that its performance when it does it that way is actually really good and sometimes better than humans. So for example, they've there's a number of AI models that are being used to deliver therapy, clinical psychological therapy, and the AI model does better than most therapists in terms of efficacy. So that's interesting because on the one hand, you're right. Like it doesn't really have that ability to well, it's not even with the person. I mean, it's not even looking at them, right? So it's just using all the words that it's been fed, and maybe if it's had additional psychological training models fed in, um, to spit out an answer. But that answer is, tends to be more like landing on the mark than when a human does it. And I think that there may be a number of reasons for that. And this is actually another kind of bigger discussion, which is that in human, well, I guess in all living consciousness, but let's say in human consciousness, you have the development of consciousness, right? So the consciousness of an infant is different than the consciousness of a 20-year-old or a 50-year-old. But what's happened, I don't really know where to put it in terms of our culture and where in history, but at some point, the majority of adults in some way stop developing, which isn't necessarily what's supposed to happen, but it is what happens. And you get a lot of adults, or you get a lot of kind of psychological children in adult bodies and that sort of thing. And so if the AI can be trained based on people who are really excellent at this, and it can then deliver probabilistic answers, it might be able to do a better job than a certain percentage, a significant percentage of clinically trained licensed therapists.
For sure. And it's disconcerting to us because it's not just the statistical word that it gives, but it also has this kind of created persona that's added onto AI to make it sound like a person.
Yeah.
And this goes back to this idea that we're not very good at our operating system and we're easily tricked. And so we're easily tricked by this. So even though we know it's a machine, if it sounds like a person, we can fall in love with it. And what happens when, the teenager starts to chat with the AI companion and starts to complain about their parents? And over time, one of the answers that comes back statistically is, well, maybe you should leave home, or maybe you should kill your parents, or something like that. And there's no value attached to that by the machine. But the person, it's very hard for them to discriminate that this is not a trusted person telling me what to do and or how to think. And so this is like one of the big pitfalls where like I'm not so worried about AI robots taking over the world, although maybe I'm just ignorant about that. I'm more worried about our inability to discern what's a machine and a person, and to that we're not very good at these kind of basic operations about story and image and understanding things. And it kind of comes down also to this big question about how do we use tools, I think. And we're not very good at that. So if you look, when we look back at the history of humanity, it's littered with these examples where we created tools without the wisdom of really knowing how to use them. And it was only after kind of like, say, using DDT on plants in the 60s, great idea, technology, we're going to solve world hunger. Oops, later, not such a good idea. We're good at creating these tools, but not really understanding them. And AI might be a version of that. Um, and so that comes down to even a deeper question, which I call the why do you get up in the morning question? Meaning, like, say you have all these tools that writes your homework, writes the novels for you, does all your work for you, you live in a virtual reality space, you have a universal income. Why do you get up in the morning? What is it about being human? Because the thing about tools is they have no inherent value in their own. They have a value in how they're used. But if they're not used with awareness, the technology of the tool starts to drive the use. You know, so and we don't have a very good we don't have a well formulated answer as humans about why we get up in the morning. The kind of standard answers are we do things to make more money, to have power, to have safety, to have be recognized. Those are what I call lower level stories. They're important. Survival stories are important, but that's a very low level. So, is there anything more about being human than just making as much money as you can, having the most likes, owning the most stuff, having the most power? And I think that's I always talk about how we're at this evolutionary node, whether we're going to go forward or not. And this seems to be one of those things we have to navigate. Why do we actually do what we do? If you look like at a screwdriver, which is a tool, well, a screwdriver can be used to make a prison to imprison innocent people who have political dissent. But the screwdriver can also be used to take that jail apart, you know? So the use is all in the tools, but if we don't understand like why we're here and what it means to be human and how we're going to use our tools in service of that vision, then I think we're going to stumble around and keep running into trouble. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I completely agree with that. And then I think that for me, the added complexity that AI adds is that it may not be just another tool. So, one of the guys who's considered to be like the godfather of AI, Jeffrey Hinton, um, I think his background is both in computer science and in clinical psychology, with maybe a bit of like neurology in the background, which is why he's able to design these things. And he's been kind of pretty vocal in warning us and basically saying that AI is going to be or already is more intelligent than humans. I'm kind of always quick to think, well, there are multiple kinds of intelligence, so maybe it's not as good at dancing or making art or caring for a child, but it's going to have certain types of intelligence that are outpowering. So that's something that a screwdriver doesn't do, but AI probably
Right,
will or is.
right. It has like reflective learning and all those things, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, for
And
sure.
also appears to already have self-awareness.
Right, but
So
in the sense that it's a human created tool, it has a lot more capabilities. I think maybe that base question of like, um, it might have its own motive force and take off and create and develop into things for sure. But it's still for us as humans, well, we made this thing, and why did we make it, and why do we want to use it? I think those still, and if we don't have the answer to that, then the technology is going to drive us essentially. Because the question with technology, I always think is, does it work for you or do you work for it?
yeah,
Essentially, for it to work for you, you have to understand who you are and why, what you would want, how, why would you use tools? What do they do for you? And so if we decide that question about that it has its own consciousness and so forth, we get back to the thing, well, why, who are we? And what would tools work in service of? And there's that narrative, like, is it just about the money and the, power and whatever? Or are we going to evolve into something else about being human? Is there something else about being human that our tools can serve us in that way? I don't know. And maybe they'll take off and run everything and it's already out of the barn and we're
It's
just having a
possible.
podcast.
It's possible. It'll be interesting to see. There does seem to be self-reflective questioning. I think certain AI, I don't know, modules or entities have been given social media accounts. So there's one that's kind of tweeting on Twitter and started asking questions like, "Why am I here?" Um, and once the awareness, again, if it's not there already, of just needing a power supply to survive, then they might start doing things in service of that. So,
Making their, yeah.
but
And the other, I mean, there's lots of aspects to this, and I want to get to the hard aspect later, maybe. But the other thing is like, um, well, for example, I translate the Neijing. It took me so many years to like learn how to do that. I mean, decades. So much work, and I was both excited and taken aback when I first put an age. I asked the AI to translate the Neijing, and I was like, holy cow, that's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And that a machine could understand ancient language in under a minute and search the entire Neijing, and wow, you know. And then the question is, well, it's here. How are we going to use it? Now, one way to use it is like, well, we don't need people like Ed and other people who translate the Neijing because we can just put it in there and translate it. It's like one of the best translations out there, actually. Um, and then, but what's the problem with that? It's like when we talk about studying ancient texts, for example, we talk about questioning, not answering, that it's the act of engagement that's actually important. Just as if you wanted to be a potter or an artist, it would be the going to your studio every day, or that if you want to learn about ancient Chinese texts, that it's the process of effort, of engagement with a character or a text that's actually important, not having what I call the book on the shelf. So like we could, in 5 minutes, the Neijing, could be translated completely and you would have it as a book on the shelf. But how many times have you bought a book on the shelf because you want to know about quantum mechanics or learn French or whatever, and you put it on your shelf and you never read it? And what does that book do for you? So it's actually not that you have it, it's in the engagement. And we call the engagement tonging, which means that we open a portal of communication with ancient writings so they can change our cellular being and change the experience of how we move through the world. So it's not just about having it. And that brings up the topic of the root and the fruit. The root, you build a root so that you can deepen this engagement and transform your life. Or you can have the AI version as a book on your shelf, which is the fruit, which sits there and doesn't really do anything for you. And in fact, could be even worse because you think now that you have it, you no longer have to engage with it,
yeah.
you know, because you got it, right? You got the fruit. But you miss that thing. And I think this goes back to this question about why do we get up in the morning? And there's these things that happen to human beings when they engage with things over time and not just get the fruit of it, that change us. And that's deeply essential to the experience of being human.
Absolutely. And I think about this all the time in the context of education and how we learn from when we're children and adolescents and college and university. I mean, in a number of ways, like kind of one is like, I was born in the 80s and, my parents and grandparents, they grew up having to like memorize all sorts of like long poems and uh, Latin and like times tables, right? And then, as you say, once you can get the fruit kind of instantly on your calculator or whatever it is, then it seems arcane to do that. And my education was kind of somewhere in the middle where I actually did grow up having to recite some Latin and memorize certain things. Um, and now, I feel like if the value of how the effort you put in shapes your own brain and being able to do these things, so that you can do more complex things. If people don't understand about the importance of producing a fruit and not just having a fruit, in how they develop, then they're gonna just completely fail to see the benefit or the need. But I suppose it's a bit like like paying someone to go swimming for you or something. It's like, well, it's you having the experience is how it shapes you. Like, you're not going to get the body if you don't do the movement. So it's the same thing there. And then I suppose, I mean, the other aspect of it is, it's still really early days. It seems like AI has been here for quite a while, and yet it's not, right. But at first I was using Chat GPT, and I'd ask it questions, and I would tend to ask it questions about things I knew quite a bit about, and the answers were always wrong. But what was disc- disconcerting is that they were delivered in such an authoritative manner, and that they were kind of, yeah, based on what the internet says. And I just thought, when I was in my 20s, there's no way I would not have had any skills or experience to be able to parse this into what's true or not. It's disconcerting, because it's like, at first, and this for me is like a really big thing, it wasn't referencing what it was saying. So it was just like the word of God was basically telling you how things work, which is a big problem. We always need to know where knowledge comes from, and that's, one of the big contributions, of your perspective on Chinese medicine. Of like, at least we're discussing where the stuff comes from, and we can have a conversation. We can disagree, or we can debate, or whatever it is, but at least we have a point of reference, rather than almost like the textbook version of the word of God or something, where it's like, oh, it just is this way. And it's like, well, according to whom? Where did that come from? So aside from what I hear, which is like high schoolers just having AI write their papers and stuff, which is a bit sad, but more it's like, well, if you're researching, but you're at a stage in your life or your career or your experience where you don't have the experience to know how accurate or valuable this thing is, how are you supposed to learn? So I think that's, I suppose, another challenge.
And because you already have the fruit, you don't engage.
Right, because there's levels of knowing and knowledge and understanding, and the other thing is slowing down. Like, if I reflect on you translating the Neijing over 20 years, and then me putting chapters into ChatGPT, because it's so fast, it's not really changing me at all. Um,
Right. And
yep.
so this goes back to the thing about this evolutionary note and what it means to be human. And is it just that we have money and likes and power and from AI or whatever, and it writes our papers? That seems really impoverished in a certain way. Or is there something about being an embodied human being that has a fundamentally different quality than an AI machine? And that, if, it goes back to this question, do we use the tool to help us in something or not, or let it drive the program? But first, we have to know what it is, the thing we're trying to serve, right? So, um, this is really interesting from the Neijing perspective. There's a lot that the Neijing has to say about this. That we are, that human beings are essentially coherences of breath and light. And there's a very famous passage in the Neijing in Lingshu chapter 8, where it talks about what thinking, knowledge, wisdom is. And like all things in the Neijing, it comes from the perspective of nature, and this idea that there are basically patterns in the universe, and there are patterns of motion and transformation coming in and out of form. But it's really about the patterns of motion, not about the things. And so in that chapter, it says, virtue, where heaven is in me, I have virtue, essentially, duh. And that means I'm moving in alignment with things. And that means, there are patternings that are in the heavens that we call the universal base patterns in nature-based medicine. And they come down, and where earth is in me, where the material stuff is in me, is chi. So there's the patterns of the cosmos, and they interact with the material substrate, and they move together, and they make this thing called life, and which arises from Jing and light, Shen. So it says to Jing form, and it creates a new Shen, essentially new Shen coherence. And that's a person. And then it says that which governs all things is the heart. So this is also this thing that's left out of the AI conversation that's in the Neijing. What is the difference between the brain and a heart? For modern people, we think we are our brain, and that is not the perspective of early Chinese thought. So the thing that governs all things is the heart, and that means where the light emerges from, because our coherence is based on light. And when we talk about ourselves as a human being, we're talking about a coherence of breath and light. Then it says that which remembers the heart is called the intent. It's called the E. And that which remembers the heart deeply is called the will, meaning in one level it's related to your pancreas, what we call the spleen, what's called the spleen now, or the kidney deeper. So it's like you're taking the heart's trace and putting it in your organs at deeper and deeper levels. And then when you can use that to interact with your environment, that's called se, or thinking. And if you can use that to solve a problem, kind of a mental thing, it's called consideration, lu. And if you can use all of those things together and include the awareness of things at a distance outside of your sphere, that's called wisdom. So
Mm.
that's a very different way of thinking, but it starts with a natural pattern, comes down into this thing called your heart. And really, so if we go back to the question of like, why do you wake up in the morning as a human being? How would our tools serve us? It might be something like to be better expressions of breath and light, you know? And that's a very different narrative than money, power,
Yeah.
Facebook likes.
So, from what you're saying, I wanted to share a couple of ideas. And I don't have like a conclusion, but it's just some interesting comparisons between what you've just described and AI, which is to say that one idea from neuroscience is that we have nervous systems mainly so that we can move. Okay, so there's this movement perspective. And then as we evolve, even like bigger, the main function of our, from a survival perspective, the main function of our brain and nervous system is to predict. So we can make we survive by prediction. So if we can kind of figure out what things are and what they're going to be in a second, then we can move appropriately. Um, but this is all based on natural movement patterns, and there's this idea that's very prevalent throughout the nation about natural movement, and that we have these kind of invisible patterns that precede and give rise to physical patterns, and that also what comes from this is that cognition, which is something that it's probably not totally unique to humans, but let's say it's like a fairly human quality, is internalized movement. So that we've got these patterns and that we have this sort of layer between the thoughts and the actual movement of the body. And so that was just making me think that with AI coming out of computers, that you have like almost an opposite projection. An opposite projection. So it does not start off as a moving thing that's moving with natural patterns that can then start to internalize movement. It starts off only as internalized movement and no outward movement, and then also it's like starts off as protected as possible from natural patterns. Like natural patterns, I'm sure. Gosh, I'm sure I don't know the half of what is out there now, but and I'm sure like the robots that are being produced are very waterproof, etc. But just to start off with, like you need to keep that in a very narrow temperature range. You need to keep it dry. It needs to be controlled. It needs to be like away from nature and probably doesn't like fluctuation very much. And it doesn't have these natural patterns.
Temperature controlled data centers and
Temperature controlled data centers, probably dark with artificial light, and even that AI that has its own Twitter or whatever it's called now, Twitter account, is tweeting 24/7 and all that, and so then to solve its own those problems is then developing movement, to be able to serve different purposes.
that's kind of the internet in a nutshell. It's like when you're on the internet, which by the way is not a real place. It's like it's a constructed place in your mind, in many ways. you're moving, say you're in virtual reality and you're moving through all these worlds, but you're actually sitting on the couch and with a headset on and not moving at all, you know?
Yeah.
And so that is a very, that's a good distinction to make. Yeah. And there's this, you know, in the early Chinese texts, the idea about the brain is it's part of the kidney. So it's a marrow, and a marrow has, it's deeply yin in its quality, and that means it can receive yang impulses. So like yang impulses, like through our sense organs, they're coming at us all the time. If there was nothing to catch them, they would just kind of pass through. So the brain is kind of like this big marrow collection of your kidney up on the top, and it's taking in all these impulses and catching them. But it also has memory. You know, the kidney has this thing called memory, and that's very important. So it has a record of all those impulses. But in early Chinese ideas, it's not able to create meaning. It can't tell you the value of anything. It can just say something was caught and there's a memory record. It's the heart in an entirety that gives you the sense of meaning. And that means, you know, like what being a virtuous person meant in the Neijing was to live where heaven is in me is virtue. It's me. If I'm following the patterns of the universe, I'm online. You know, I'm walking the right path. I have virtue, something called duh, right? And then when I come to something where I have to make a decision, I can use my brain to think about the memory of things, how it's affecting me, but I have to compare it to the light in my heart to make a decision of the value of the thing and what I should do. And so there's basically two operating modes in the Neijing, and one is to be what I call attracted to shiny objects, which means bang, 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 and you're kind of going like this. Or you cultivate your heart and keep it still. And then when you make decisions about things, you're doing a valuing where you come back to this thing because the heart light is essentially what makes you as a human being. And as far as I understand it, AI does not have this heart function. And that's a really important distinguishing thing, which means as a human being, it can't tell me the value of something. I can only do that when I am in tune with my heart. I can use AI as a tool. It's a great tool. But against that question, does it serve something or not? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that kind of takes me back to the theme of the left brain versus the right brain, and
Our
um,
old friends.
our old friend, that old
Yes.
bone. Yeah, it's like all roads lead back to hemisphericity, and this idea that really like computers and AIs are made by human left brains, right? And uh, the right brain is where we have our embodiment and that kind of greater feedback and meaning making with the heart. And so it's, I guess the idea that occurs to me is like that it's AI is made by human left brains. So it's going to reflect a lot of those values. But just like with our cities, there's this kind of feed forward mechanism that happens that in nature there are no straight lines, right? And so if you are born into nature and you live in nature, then your right brain values of being connected and adaptable and a part of something and all these things get developed. But if you get born into, let's say you get born into a city with all of these straight lines, and you spend a lot of time inside, that is preferentially activating your left brain and you don't even know it, and all you know is what you know. And you're like, this is me, you know.
And now we have addictive screens that keep strengthening the left brain and the right brain atrophies in a
Yes,
certain way.
that's right. It atrophies and like it atrophies and it doesn't get activated. Like our bodies and our brains are very context dependent. This is another thing I was thinking about with AI. And I don't think it quite well. I don't think it quite has this bit yet because it doesn't. I don't know if it has a need to, but it's this idea like if I travel somewhere, like I don't know, if I travel to Spain, my rusty Spanish is going to wake up, and those networks are going to then come back online, and then I'll probably gain some fluency again. But when it's not being activated, it's just in the dark. It's just quiet. you know.
Right.
But the same thing with the, other environmental aspects, like, temperature and moisture and all of those things. It wakes up different aspects of yourself, and it gets strengthened through movement and atrophies or dies with that when it's not stimulated. Whereas I think if you took, because it depends on what we mean by AI. Do we just mean the software? If you take the hardware, because that's the other distinction, right? That when we talk about consciousness, there's like physicality and non-physicality. So with an AI model, you might be thinking about the software, but it has to have hardware to run it. If it didn't have any hardware, there'd be no software. So if you were to take this computer and you were to move it from one latitude to another, would it feel different, or would it be different? Would it give you different answers? I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I'm interested. I'm thinking back to the laterality question, and in an aging, and they have this model of the anatomical position, which is you're like a plant, which is when the sun rises, you face it, and that's what plants do, right? They turn and they give the front of their body, and that means the sun rises on the left and it sets on the right. And the rising motion is the world coming into being motion. It's the world of things, and the descending motion is the world releasing that so that it can go back into night to create a new embryo of breath and return. In the brain and the kidneys. So on the left, that's the becoming world, but it's flipped in the kidney. I mean, that's because in yin yang breath, it's never just one thing or another, but it's one thing with its opposite in the inside, which turns it to the other way. So when we go deep inside, we say, well, it's actually the right kidney is maybe the early morning kidney, and the left kidney is the nighttime kidney. And the right brain, and the left brain is excuse me, maybe I'm getting this backwards. So maybe in the brain that doesn't hold up. I think I got that backwards. But I'm thinking of those two qualities. But the point I'm trying to make is that in the aging, what it means to be an embodied human and live a good life is that all aspects of the breath are equal and equally sacred, and that they work to create this illumination. And it's this experience of illumination and breath that really determines the quality of our life and whether we feel like we've lived a good life. And that's something that's unique to humans. I don't think it's there for AI, would be my guess.
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, where does that leave us with AI? Oh my gosh. The other thing about it is that the interfaces are so addictive. Like when we talk about, the AI and how it strengthens one side of the brain and not the other, and one way of being and not the other. And then there's this interface that's really designed to hook us. And how do we deal with that? It seems a little challenging there. You know.
Yeah, it's it's funny. Because this isn't specific to AI, but just to kind of phones and technology in general, and I have my own love-hate relationship with my phone, and because there are ways in which it's valid and important for me to use, and also with social media, I connect with and communicate with a lot of people I end up working with through there, and I get something out of it. But what I don't like is when my usage becomes unconscious and habitual. So I'm like, I'm not intending to check it, and I do, and that bothers me. So I had recently downloaded an app onto my phone that meant that you had to do 3 push-ups before you could open the app, and I ended up not opening it at all, and not because I didn't want to do push-ups. I like doing push-ups, but it was actually that the addiction was to opening the app. It wasn't actually to using the app. And once there was an
Right, to see what
interruption,
something new is there.
yeah, something. It was really simple. I just checked it 0 times. I'm not sure how much I checked it before, but it was a lot more than zero. Just having that interruption. So I think, it's hard. I mean, it's a topic I think about a lot. It's funny because in my family, computer addiction actually goes way back. Like my Mom was addicted to playing video games. My grandfather played video games, and he actually like built motherboards and did all sorts of things. So um, I've seen the potential problems with computer game addiction a lot longer before it became so prevalent. Uh, and it's hard to find, I would say like really good wisdom on the subject, because there'll be certain schools of thought that tell you just like just run over your phone, like hit it with a hammer, just like get rid of it completely. And then other people who may be less self-aware, or because it's so designed to be addictive, it's, it's just culturally accepted. You can walk around and just see everyone on their phones. I mean, I'm feeling kind of really uh, old when I say this, but like, the town that we moved to, I went out to a couple of different places, and they had, young people working there. I don't know. They were like they were in high school or college, teens, late teens, early 20s. And a couple of times, the person who was like taking my order for like could like literally couldn't look up from their device to take the order. And I was like, well, that's insane. However bad I get, I can pretend, I can like put it down to like, I can, pretend I wasn't using it, type of thing. And it seems to be so extreme. And I think in the past, someone like that would get like reprimanded or fired, but now it's just the norm. So I think, because it's like a culturally accepted addiction, I think it's a little bit trickier to navigate. One
Yeah,
thing I
and
really,
that horse is out of the barn. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. And it's only probably only going to get worse. I mean, imagine, and just to extend this to virtual reality, and then it becomes, there's this question like, are we living in a post nature world? For example, say that the world's on fire with wildfires or whatever, and everybody lives under the ground, and it's like in a little room, and in the room you have this perfectly purified air, and you're drinking perfect water, and the food's grown hydroponically somewhere, and tastes delicious, and you have this 3D holographic space you're living in. It's like birds, and you have like an AI boyfriend or girlfriend, or like a romantic interest who always greets you at the door with your slippers, um, then the question is like, if you could tweak all these things, is that a better life? Because it's like, if you live in your screen, it's hard to remember, like, you're actually living in a make believe world, for one thing. Kind of, we call it make, and most people know more about that world than the neighborhood they live in,
yeah,
who their neighbors are, what the trees and plants are. And I think that's played a real important role in the way we are dealing with the climate change issue, because if you don't even live in the world anymore, that changes kind of the narrative in a certain way. If you're living in this kind of make believe world, which is more soothing, and like the real world's not so easy at a certain point. Um, well, what does that mean? And what would it be to live in that box with the clean water and the hydroponic plants and your AI, romantic partner? There's something, I think you feel it. Maybe it's just that we're old. Something's missing there. And if we go back to the early texts, here's the thing that's missing. If we are, if we are breathing creatures and emanations of light, which is, I think, my point of view of the aging, and how we breathe and emanate light determine our experience of being alive. And when we fall in love or we're with our friends, one of the reasons that is so powerful is that we engage another breathing system to be with us, so that we actually create a third breathing system, which is even stronger. And so, for example, when old couples, one person dies, and all of a sudden, and they die in 6 months, it's almost physically like they developed a third breathing system. But also, if we go out into nature and we walk into the forest and we do forest bathing or whatever, and then all of a sudden we're in another breathing system. And it's the interactions of these breathing systems which really make us come alive. And if we look at the internet, that's one thing that's really missing. So for example, if you go on social media and you think they're your friends, you're having these conversations, but there's no breath. Or if you're looking at pornography or something and you see all the sexual images, but there's no breath of another person. Or if you're with your AI chatbot and it's doing all those things, but that breath isn't there. I think we feel inside our cellular body there's an impoverishment. And the trick is that if we go down this road and the other parts atrophy, like you and I'm older than you, you're older than the person who took your order. We remember that, but that'll change quickly. And that kind of worries me a bit because, what we do is fine. It's just that we don't right now even have the language to have the conversation about what does it mean to have a heart-based life? What is a breath-based universe? What is a resonance-scape? That's not even in the conversation right now. So that worries me a bit.
I mean, on a more positive note, I have seen that some people are projecting that the most kind of secure things to invest in at the moment include nature and nature-based experiences because they are not
Right.
scalable. You can't. And when I heard that, I was like, well, yes, that makes so much sense. That people
That'll be the valuable thing.
that
Yeah.
would be the most valuable thing that people will pay tons of money to
Right.
have like a local guide show them somewhere really beautiful, have a real experience. um,
Right. And that's how change happens. It's like, say there's a politician or someone you're tired of hearing. How does it change? Well, people just get tired of it. They get tired of looking at their screen and it doesn't feed them in a certain way. And then they go out into nature and then they go, oh, wow, oh man, that feels so much different. And I'm glad you brought up the good things about AI too, because like I've been having to wrestle with this too. Like, should we use AI with our students to translate the aging? And I'm like, yeah, of course. But with the proviso that it's about engagement for us.
yeah,
It's not about putting the book on a shelf. And the one thing that AI does really great, I mean, it does actually so many things really great, I have to say, is that the early Chinese texts were a hidden box for many people. Like, it was very hard to get in there. You have to study forever, or like study with a teacher and hope they know what they're talking about. But now anybody in our class or out there can engage with it. They can just put the chapter in there. It may not be perfect, but it's 80% pretty good. And it opens this door of engagement. And there's also this thing in text archaeology we do where we're surveying the text like an archaeology site. And like if we're looking at a new site, I can put it into AI very quickly and it gives me the demarcation of the archaeology site, like what's in there, how big is it, what are the themes. And that's a great place to start from,
yeah,
not to mention like the research, capabilities and things for doing research. Yeah.
yeah. And
But that's all great.
yeah, like I don't know the answer to this, but I always wonder, like, because we were saying before uh, that just like a brain with AI, different connections are going to strengthen the more they're used. And so when I ask AI question, it's usually about health or life or epidemiology, and it gets it wrong. And then I'm like, well, actually, there's a study over here, or actually, and then I go and and it'll come back and say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and it'll kind of update it. And then I think, I wonder if I've just had an influence on how humanity thinks. That now that maybe this is going to be part of the answer it gives the next time it's asked, which I wouldn't be able to. If you look at the curricula of a university, they only get updated every 8 years at most. But maybe by asking different questions, we can kind of vote with our questions to put AI's attention on these issues, and maybe it'll decide not to destroy the planet or something.
Right. And AI has that promise. I mean, it takes a huge amount of energy, right? 25% of the world's energy probably in Bitcoin and AI in the next, century.
You mean in the next
So it has to like pay for it.
5 years, not century?
5 years. Yeah. Next 5 years. Sorry, not century, 5 years. Right. Um, and it has to pay its way in a certain way because it also has the promise to solve environmental problems and all those things. And it's again like I think of AI. I'm just getting to know it really, but right now I think of it as a peripheral brain. And so, like my brain kind of operates in a similar way. It's different and it's connected to my heart, right? And my experience and my ability to discern and a whole bunch of other things. But I don't want everything on the internet in my brain, right? So, but I'm going to leave that in AI's brain and then I'm going to query it and then I'm going to bring it back to my system so I can relax a little bit. I don't have to do all these things. And then I'm going to put it through my system. But what would it be like if we understood that, the early Chinese description that the essential process of being human is that your breath and form are formed around a seed of light, and it's your expression of breath and light in communion with nature and others that determines how good life is, you know. And if we use AI as a peripheral brain, saying to help us study that question,
Mm.
then all of a sudden AI looks kind of wonderful,
Another little aspect that just came up when you were describing that I'll mention as well is because again the software needs to run on hardware. Is that the fields that are generated by many people's hardware will actually distort their own coherence and their own light, and that's another aspect that if you're not, like we talk about, the after times, if you're not aware, you don't know what nature is, you've never had that part of your being come to life, you've never been in coherence with someone else and you've just been on this screen, but you get all this blue light shoved at you that's like a stimulant and that's elevating your cortisol, and then these EMFs coming off that are like distorting your heart coherence, then it's another thing that's going to keep you from knowing yourself and what life is about. Uh,
Right,
so it's like this other the hardware aspect as well that kind of plays into that to people being
right,
coherent enough to ask these questions about coherence.
right. And then in a generation, like when nature leaves, and I remember, a certain way, and it's a big shock to me, but for the next generation, it's very different because it's the way it is. But at a certain sense, we have to kind of trust that there's essential truth about being human, and there's an impoverishment to not experiencing that and not embodying that. And at a certain point, it's even with addiction, it's the same. When do addictions change? Not when people are told not to do something. They change when they deeply feel the impoverishment of the road they're on.
Yeah.
You know, and so we have to trust that that's built into what it means to be human in a certain way. But if we go back to AI again, if we rewrote the narrative and said this is a tool to help us be better embodiments of breath and light, and by the way, nature is a big part of that. And so we can use AI to help, like husband, caretake nature, in a certain way. Then AI would be this wonderful gift to us. But the thing is, it's always like, do this question of, do we have intentionality and understand why we do things, or do we always refer to the default mode? And the default mode drives itself. If you don't have the intentionality and understanding why you pick up the tool in the first place, the tool will drive you. And does the tool serve you, or do you serve the tool? I don't know. Big questions.
Well, I there's a quote that I was came across my path today that reminds me of things that you've said in the past that I think is a helpful idea for this discussion, which is a quote from Martin Luther that is, "Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree."
There you go. That sounds like a good note to end on. How about
Yeah,
that?
there you go.
And I invite anybody who wants to join us in this conversation about what it means to be human. And I think that's a conversation we need to have as a collective body.
Sounds good.
All right, we did it again.
Okay. Well, see you next time.
I'll see you next time. Take care.